Thank you for joining me for today's discussion on the term Convict Gothic, an often overlooked subgenre of Australia's Gothic traditions, as we like to pretend we all began as a nation of upstanding colonists. Convict Gothic explores the dark psychological and physical horrors of colonial penal colonies. Rather than using traditional supernatural monsters, it derives its terror from the harsh landscapes, systemic brutality, and the lingering traumas of convict life. Each episode of Essays from a Strange Country looks at who Australians are through the lens of what our culture has produced, such as an Australian film, literature, art, and music, to ask how this country has imagined itself. This is not a search for one neat national identity. Mercifully, no such thing exists. Instead, we'll read through the mess, the stories, images, songs, and screen myths that make Australia feel familiar, strange, beautiful, brutal, and faintly ridiculous. And I'm your host, Jasmine Wolfe. Australian culture has come a long way from its early days as a carefree nation of beach bums, barbecues, and overly self-assured real estate brokers. It began, in the British imagination at least, as a dumping ground with weather, the dungeon of the world, the far end of empire, a place where Britain could exile its criminals and then pretend the moral problem had been solved. Convict Gothic is born from this gloomy little dream. It is not just a compilation of eerie photos featuring chains, ruins, insane people, and unfriendly environments, though it does enjoy them. It is a cultural structure built from contradiction, the colonial dream of reform set against the lived reality of punishment, degradation, and administrative cruelty. The convict system was sold through the language of improvement. Evangelical and utilitarian reformers imagined transportation as a kind of moral machinery, a system in which labour, discipline, silence, religion, and surveillance would remake criminals into useful subjects. Van Diemen's Land, especially under Sir George Arthur, became the great laboratory for this experiment, a natural penitentiary where landscape itself seemed to assist punishment. The bush, the sea, the distance from Britain, and the architecture of prisons all worked together to produce a colonial purgatory. In theory, suffering purified. Yet the counter-image was always there, and it proved harder to bury. Critics such as Sir William Molesworth and Archbishop Richard Whately argued that transportation did not reform the convict, but brutalized him. The penal colony, they suggested, was not a moral workshop, but an empire of hell, a system that manufactured fiends while calling the process redemption. This clash between reformist rhetoric and carceral violence gave Australian Gothic its central energy. Authority speaks in the language of virtue, the landscape answers with terror, the convict body carries the evidence. This tension lays a foundation for Australian culture across literature, film, art, and music. Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life turns convict history into Gothic national myth, glorifying the past into a spectacle of suffering, endurance, and institutional sadism. Colonial ruins such as Port Arthur become more than heritage sites. They are monuments to a nation oddly keen to aestheticize its own punishment. In film, the Gothic landscape persists in works such as Wake in Fright, where the outback becomes less a setting than a trap with flies. In music, from convict ballads and Frank the Poet to later memorial songs, the transported prisoner remains a figure through whom Australia rehearses its suspicion of authority and its affection for the doomed battler. Convict Gothic, therefore, does more than decorate Australian culture with darkness. It supplies one of its founding myths. Australia as a place of exile, moral testing, institutional hypocrisy, and survival under pressure. The nation's literature, art, film, and music repeatedly return to this origin because the contradiction has never quite gone away. Australia likes to imagine itself as relaxed, egalitarian, and allergic to pretension. Fair enough. But beneath that self-image sits an older story, a continent imagined as punishment, governed as experiment, and remembered as haunting. Before Australia became a nation, a tourist brand, or a mining concern with a flag attached, it was already a Gothic idea. European imagination had done the hard work early. The antipodes were not merely far away, they were inverted, uncanny, and faintly obscene. A place beneath the world, a place where seasons ran backwards, animals seemed assembled by committee, trees shed bark rather than leaves, and the very logic of nature appeared to have had a long lunch. In this sense, Australia entered British culture as a grotesque space, a landscape out of kilter before most Britons had seen so much as a gum leaf. The Gothic did not arrive with the convicts, it was waiting at the dock. This matters because Convict Gothic did not simply describe penal Australia after the fact. It gave colonial Australia one of its first coherent cultural scripts: exile, punishment, reversal, and entrapment. The colony was imagined as Britain's underside, its buried conscience, its dark subconscious given geography. Transportation turned metaphor into policy. Britain did not merely send criminals away, it staged a national cleansing ritual at imperial scale. The unwanted were cast into the world's basement, and the basement was then asked to become a respectable society. Naturally, complications followed. The phrase "dungeon of the world" captures the core symbolic work of Convict Australia. A dungeon is not just a prison, it is hidden architecture. It belongs below the visible order of things. It stores what polite society needs removed but not quite forgotten. Penal Australia functioned in precisely this way for Britain. It was distant enough to make punishment disappear and present enough to reassure the metropole that justice had been done. The transported convict became a living contradiction, expelled from Britain yet still governed by it, socially dead yet economically useful, morally condemned yet supposedly available for reform. That contradiction would become one of the deepest patterns in Australian Gothic culture. The stain of convictism is central here. Colonial respectability spent much of the 19th century pretending that the stain could be scrubbed out with churches, courthouses, wool wealth, and enough neo-Gothic stonework to make even a bishop feel underdressed. But Gothic culture thrives on what refuses burial. The convict past became exactly that. An origin story both disavowed and compulsively revisited. Australian culture has repeatedly returned to scenes of confinement, forced labour, wrongful punishment, institutional cruelty, and moral ambiguity because the nation's beginnings were never clean enough to support a simple heroic myth. The past kept knocking, sometimes in chains. This is why Convict Gothic is foundational rather than merely historical. It establishes Australia not as an innocent new world, but as a space already burdened by memory, fear, and displacement. Unlike the American frontier myth, with its tedious enthusiasm for freedom and self-making, the Australian colonial myth begins with people who did not want to be here. The foundational movement is not expansion but removal, not liberty but sentence, not arrival but exile. Even the landscape is quickly drawn into this structure. It is not a passive backdrop. It is vast, strange, illegible, and frequently hostile to imported European assumptions. The bush, the coast, the prison island, the interior, All become zones where identity is tested and often broken. Convict Gothic therefore supplies Australian culture with a grammar of reversal. Britain's legal order produces lawlessness. Christian reform produces brutality. Civilization arrives as violence. The colony promises renewal but begins in coercion. These reversals are not decorative Gothic flourishes. They are structural. They explain why Australian literature, film, art, and music so often return to trapped bodies, haunted landscapes, corrupt authorities, and communities built on silence. The culture inherits not only the fact of convictism, but its mood, suspicion, fatalism, black humour, and a persistent awareness that respectable institutions may be wearing someone else's skin. The Gothic also helped transform shame into cultural material. What begins as the stain of convict origins becomes, over time, a source of narrative power. Australian culture does not simply confess the darkness of its beginnings. It stylizes it, argues with it, markets it, mocks it, and occasionally pretends to have moved on. Convict ruins become heritage sites, penal records become novels, bush melancholy becomes art. Old ballads turn suffering into performance. The dungeon does not vanish. It becomes architecture, myth, atmosphere. So the foundation of Australian Gothic lies in this grim little inheritance. Australia was imagined as unnatural before it was colonised, then made penal once it was occupied. The result was a culture born inside a contradiction. The colony was meant to be a place of punishment and reform, banishment and rebirth, imperial control and colonial beginning. No wonder its cultural imagination learned to distrust sunlight. Convict Gothic gave Australia its first major symbolic landscape, a world upside down, filled with exiles, watched by authority and haunted by the suspicion that hell might not be elsewhere after all.
You are hereby sentenced to be transported beyond the seas to such a place as His Majesty shall direct and appoint for the term of your natural life.
The convict system did not present itself as naked brutality. That would have been too honest, and therefore administratively inconvenient. Instead, it arrived wrapped in the respectable language of reform, discipline, labour, silence, surveillance, religion. The machinery of punishment was sold as moral improvement. Britain would take its criminals, ship them to the far edge of the known world, and somehow transform them into useful Christian subjects through work, suffering, and the occasional sermon. A tidy plan on paper. Empires do love paper. This was the logic behind what contemporaries described as evangelical moral machinery. A system that imagined human depravity as something that could be corrected through controlled environments and regulated conduct. The convict was not merely to be punished, he was to be remade. Labour would discipline the body, silence would restrain corrupting speech, religion would cleanse the soul. Authority would supervise the whole uplifting operation, presumably while pretending not to notice the lash marks. The result was meant to be not simply a penal colony, but a vast experiment in moral engineering. Sir George Arthur's administration in Van Diemen's Land gave this fantasy one of its clearest colonial forms. Arthur imagined the island as a kind of natural penitentiary, a place whose geography could be made to serve punishment and reform at once. Distance became part of the sentence. Isolation became moral technology. The sea itself functioned as a wall, and the bush beyond the settlements as another. Van Diemen's Land could therefore be imagined as both prison and chapel, a contained landscape in which the convict, stripped of old temptations and old associates, might be broken down and rebuilt under the powerful operation of religion. The ambition was not modest. Arthur did not merely want obedience, he wanted inward transformation. The state would discipline the body until the soul caught up. It helped create one of the central tropes of Convict Gothic, Australia as penal purgatory. Not hell exactly, at least not in the official brochure, but a place of ordeal where suffering supposedly leads to redemption. The distinction is important. Hell punishes without hope. Purgatory hurts for your own good. The convict colony occupied that convenient middle ground, where cruelty could be recoded as salvation and coercion could pass itself off as care. The landscape was not just scenery, it became an instrument of spiritual testing. Heat, distance, hunger, hard labor, isolation, the terrifying indifference of the bush, all could be folded into a narrative of correction. If the convicts suffered, that suffering was evidence that the system was working. This reformist fantasy also gave Australian Gothic its peculiar moral texture. European Gothic often depends on castles, monasteries, ancestral curses, and decaying aristocratic power. Convict Gothic has different architecture. Its haunted spaces are barracks, chain gangs, probation stations, cells, penal islands, road camps, and settlements carved out of hostile country. These places are Gothic not because they are medieval, but because they turn moral order into menace. The institution claims to redeem, yet its methods generate fear, secrecy, bodily pain, and psychic collapse. The horror lies in the gap between stated purpose and lived reality. A chapel beside a flogging yard is not a contradiction in this world. It is the design principle. The notion of reform through suffering also shaped later Australian cultural habits. Again and again, Australian literature, film, and art return to landscapes that test people beyond reason, as though hardship were the national curriculum and everyone had somehow forgotten to unenroll. The bush, the desert, the island prison, the remote town, these are not neutral settings, they inherit the logic of penal purgatory. They strip characters down, expose guilt, force endurance, and rarely offer much comfort afterwards. The Australian landscape becomes morally charged but not benevolent. It judges without explaining itself. It purifies only in the sense that fire purifies. Technically true, but not much of a consolation if one happens to be the material. This is where the moral machinery becomes foundational rather than merely historical. It gave Australia a cultural grammar in which suffering is treated as revelation, authority presents violence as improvement, and the landscape itself becomes a disciplinary force. The convict is not only imprisoned by chains or walls, but by a moral story imposed from above. Suffer properly, and you may become worthy. Australian Gothic keeps returning to this structure because it is both absurd and terrifying. A whole continent was imagined as a correctional device. From that cheerful premise, a national culture began learning how to tell stories about endurance, punishment, suspicion, and survival. Not a bad origin myth, provided one has a taste for institutional darkness and badly supervised redemption.
When a man gets impossible to handle, he's put in a boat with light provisions, he's rowed out to Gromit Rock and left there entirely alone for a period. Some lose their minds, some try to jump. I often wonder if, after all, it wouldn't be kinder to flog.
The official fantasy of transportation depended on a neat moral equation. Remove the criminal from Britain, subject him to labour, discipline, scripture, and distance, and wait for virtue to appear, preferably on schedule. It was a tidy theory. Unfortunately, like many tidy theories designed by men in offices, it had to survive contact with actual bodies, actual hunger, actual flogging, and actual despair. The counter-argument to the moral machinery of convict reform was therefore not a minor administrative complaint. It was a direct assault on the moral legitimacy of the entire penal project. Critics such as Sir William Molesworth and Archbishop Richard Whately argued that transportation did not reform criminals so much as industrialize degradation. The system, they suggested, did not turn convicts into citizens, it turned them into fiends. A triumph, then, if the aim was to manufacture Gothic material. Molesworth's critique was especially damaging because it did not simply object to excess cruelty, as though the machine merely needed a bit of oil and a nicer chaplain. He attacked transportation as structurally corrupt. The penal colonies, in his view, were not unfortunate deviations from reformist ideals, but the logical outcome of those ideals when fused with imperial convenience. Britain wanted punishment made invisible. It wanted labour made cheap. It wanted criminality exported beyond the horizon. The language of redemption helped make all this sound less like slavery and more like public service. Handy, that. Molesworth's description of the system as an empire of hell stripped away the pious dressing and named transportation as a regime of coercion, bodily suffering, and moral contamination. Whately's objections were similarly severe, though framed through a Christian and utilitarian lens. He argued that transportation failed even on its own terms. If punishment was meant to deter, reform, and protect society, the convict system managed the impressive feat of doing none of these particularly well. It was expensive, brutal, inconsistent, and morally incoherent. Convicts were sent into environments where survival often required cunning, submission, violence, or complicity. The system then expressed shock when they did not emerge as polished moral subjects. This is the bureaucratic equivalent of throwing someone into a swamp and complaining about the mud. The charge that transportation was inefficient, cruel, and demoralizing matters because it exposes the central contradiction of Convict Gothic. The colony was imagined as both purgatory and hell. Purgatory implies progress. It suggests suffering with a purpose, pain as spiritual renovation, torment with a moral exit sign. Hell, by contrast, offers no such comfort. It is circular, excessive, and self-perpetuating. The convict colony became Gothic precisely because it hovered between these two visions. Administrators insisted the system purified. Critics insisted it corrupted. Australian culture inherited the tension and has been gnawing on it ever since. This is where Convict Gothic becomes more than a set of grim historical images. It provides a structure of feeling, suspicion towards authority, sympathy for the condemned, and a deep uncertainty about whether institutions exist to protect people or simply to grind them into useful shapes. The penal state appears not as a neutral dispenser of justice, but as a theatre of hypocrisy. Its governors speak of salvation while authorizing cruelty. Its chaplains preach repentance inside systems built on humiliation. Its paperwork translates suffering into categories, sentences, and labour returns. Gothic thrives in that gap between official language and lived horror. The cultural afterlife of this critique is obvious in the recurring Australian figure of the battler, the ordinary person trapped in a rigged system, surviving through endurance rather than moral approval. This figure is not simply a sentimental national mascot, though it has certainly been flogged hard enough by politicians, advertisers, and sports commentators. Its deeper roots lie in convict memory. The battler is the descendant of those who learned that authority often arrived wearing a uniform, carrying a ledger, and explaining that the whole thing was for one's own improvement. No wonder Australian culture tends to treat power with a curled lip. Respect may be offered, but rarely without checking the exits. In literature, film, art, and music, this inherited distrust becomes a Gothic habit. Institutions are oppressive, landscapes entrap, punishment exceeds justice, survival replaces redemption. The convict is not always innocent, and Australian Gothic is rarely naive enough to pretend otherwise. But guilt does not justify the grotesque machinery built around it. That is the crucial point. The horror lies not only in criminality, but in the state's claim that cruelty can be morally productive if administered with sufficient confidence. The Empire of Hell critique therefore lays one of the central foundations of Australian Gothic culture. It rejects the comforting myth that the penal colony was a harsh but necessary school for virtue. Instead, it presents colonial Australia as a place where reformist rhetoric masked exploitation, where punishment bred further corruption, and where suffering became part of the national imagination. The result is a culture drawn again and again to stories of entrapment, failed authority, and survival under pressure. Not exactly cheerful, but then neither was the source material.
Women, priests and convicts. A pack of whimpering, simpering fools.
The argument between penal reform and penal horror did not stay politely locked in parliamentary reports, where all good bureaucratic nightmares go to breed. It moved into literature, architecture, painting, and public memory. Convict Gothic became cultural material, not just a record of what happened, but a way of imagining Australia as a place where history is never safely passed. It lingers, it stains, it occasionally charges admission. Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life is the obvious centerpiece here, because subtlety was never really the point. Clarke took the documentary remains of transportation, punishment records, prison routines, escapes, floggings, bureaucratic indifference, and transformed them into a national Gothic epic. His novel does not merely describe the convict system, it glorifies it, turning colonial punishment into spectacle, trauma, and myth. The result is not history in the neat archival sense, but history as psychic weather. Convict suffering becomes the emotional climate through which Australian culture begins to understand itself. Clarke's genius, if that is the right word for such a bleak achievement, was to recognise that the convict past could not be written as a tidy moral lesson. The official fantasy of reform depended on narrative order, crime, punishment, repentance, rehabilitation. A comforting little machine, provided one did not look too closely at the gears, for the term of his natural life smashes that structure. Its protagonist, Rufus Dawes, is not purified by suffering. He is deformed by it, socially and spiritually. The penal system does not reveal divine justice, it reveals administrative cruelty, dressed up in moral vocabulary which is very on brand for empire. This is where Clarke's work becomes foundational for Australian Gothic. The terror is not supernatural in the old European sense. There are no medieval castles, no ancestral curses, no conveniently thunderous counts stalking corridors in velvet. Instead, the horror lies in institutions, landscapes, and records. The Gothic machinery is modern and colonial. The ship's hold, the chain gang, the solitary cell, the lash, the commandant's ledger. Evil is not a demon, it is paperwork plus distance. Clarke helps shift Australian Gothic away from imported European furniture and towards local conditions. The colony itself becomes the haunted structure. The prison is not merely a setting, it is the organising metaphor for the country. Transportation produces a culture in which space does not promise freedom but entrapment. The ocean isolates, the bush disorients, the settlement disciplines. Even escape becomes another form of imprisonment. Since the land beyond the penal station is often represented as vast, indifferent, and quite prepared to kill anyone foolish enough to mistake it for liberation. Australia, in this tradition, is less a new world than a trap with better weather. Port Arthur gives this literary imagination its monumental form. As a site, it carries the strange double status of ruin and shrine. It is picturesque in the annoying way ruins often are, but its beauty is inseparable from the violence that produced it. The sandstone buildings, church remains, penitentiary walls, and asylum structures turn penal ideology into architecture. Here the dream of moral reform was made physical. Silence, surveillance, labor, and isolation were not abstract principles. They were spatial arrangements. The built environment instructed bodies in obedience. It also broke them, but that part was usually filed under improvement. The Gothic power of Port Arthur comes from this tension. It was designed as a reformative machine, yet it is remembered as a theatre of suffering. Its ruins expose the failure of the moral project more effectively than any sermon against transportation could. The site now operates as a kind of national memory chamber, where visitors encounter the convict past as both heritage and horror. This is Australian Gothic doing what it does best, turning institutional violence into atmosphere, then asking everyone to admire the stonework. Visual art and architecture extend the same logic. Australian Gothic has always had an uneasy relationship with European forms because Gothic architecture arrived here as an imported language already loaded with ideas of age, authority, and spiritual depth. In Britain, Gothic revival buildings could gesture towards medieval continuity. In Australia, they had to fake ancestry on stolen land at remarkable speed. The result is often oddly comic and deeply revealing. Pointed arches, ecclesiastical seriousness, sandstone gravitas, and in some cases local flourishes such as kangaroo gargoyles. Nothing says ancient moral civilization quite like a marsupial bolted to a colonial building. Yet these architectural oddities are not just decorative jokes. They show the colony trying to graft European cultural memory onto an environment that resisted easy translation. Gothic forms in Australia become unstable because they carry old world meanings into a new world landscape marked by dispossession, penal labour, and settler anxiety. The buildings want to project order, permanence, and refinement. The context keeps muttering about violence. This unease also appears in artistic representations of the bush, especially through what Marcus Clarke famously called its weird melancholy. The phrase has become almost too convenient, but it remains useful. Clarke saw the Australian landscape as beautiful, certainly, but not in the soft pastoral mode inherited from Europe. Its beauty was strange, harsh, and spiritually unsettling. The bush did not offer cosy rural innocence. It suggested absence, silence, exposure, and dread. In Gothic terms, the Australian landscape functions less as scenery than as a pressure. It bears down on human figures. It absorbs them. It refuses to become background. This is one of the key ways Convict Gothic lays the groundwork for later Australian culture. It teaches writers and artists to see the land not as a passive stage for human drama, but as an active force entangled with punishment, exile, and survival. The convict body suffers under law, but also under climate, distance, hunger, and terrain. Human cruelty and environmental hostility become difficult to separate. That fusion persists across Australian literature, film, and art. The sense that the country is beautiful, yes, but also waiting, dryly, for you to make a mistake. The gorification of the convict past is therefore not merely sensationalism. It is a cultural method. By exaggerating brutality, Gothic representation reveals what official reform discourse tried to conceal, that the colony's moral foundations were compromised from the start. Clarke's fiction, Port Arthur's ruins, colonial Gothic architecture, and the melancholy bush all preserve the same contradiction. Australia was imagined as a place of punishment that would somehow produce renewal. Instead, its cultural memory kept returning to chains, cells, ghosts, and damaged men. A promising beginning, naturally. Convict Gothic does not stay politely buried in the archive. That would be too convenient, and Australian culture has never been especially good at leaving a corpse alone. The same imaginative machinery that turned transportation into a myth of exile, punishment, and moral rot keeps resurfacing in film and music, where the convict past becomes less a historical period than a recurring national mood. The uniforms change. The chains become roads, pubs, mines, police stations, detention centres, or just the horizon itself. But the structure remains familiar. A person is trapped in a hostile landscape, watched by dubious authority, and slowly stripped of the fantasy that Australia is a place of renewal. 19th century convict ballads were among the earliest forms of this cultural afterlife. Songs such as the Convict's Tour to Hell did not simply record suffering, they stylized it into a grim comic map of colonial existence. The convict voice in these songs is often sardonic, defiant, and bitterly alert to hypocrisy. This matters. It means the Gothic tradition in Australia was never only imposed from above by reformers, magistrates, chaplains, and other enthusiasts for a human improvement through misery. It was also sung from below. The transported prisoner became not merely an object of punishment, but a narrator of the system's absurd cruelty. The ballad form allowed convicts to convert degradation into performance and performance into memory. If the authorities wanted penitence, they received satire, a fair exchange apparently. Frank the poet is central here. His verse carries the sharpness of convict vernacular culture. Comic, resentful, morally observant, and unimpressed by official language. The moral machinery of the penal colony promised redemption through labour and obedience, but convict song often answered with ridicule. Frank's work exposes the gap between institutional rhetoric and lived experience. In doing so, it helps establish one of the durable tones of Australian cultural expression. Suspicion toward authority dressed up as virtue. This is not merely larrikin decoration, it is a political inheritance. The convict singer knows that systems of punishment often describe themselves in beautiful language. He also knows that beautiful language can be a very tidy cover for a flogging. That musical inheritance continues in later songs that return to transportation not as costume drama, but as unresolved cultural memory. Rod MacDonald's John King, for example, memorializes an actual inmate associated with Port Arthur, placing the phrase natural life back under pressure. In legal terms, for the term of his natural life indicates sentence length. In Gothic terms, it becomes something larger and nastier, a condition of being swallowed by the penal world until identity, time, and hope collapse into one another. Port Arthur in this context is not just a site. It is a machine for producing ghosts. Songs about its inmates keep those ghosts audible, reminding listeners that convict history is not softened by distance so much as made more available for national myth-making. Tourism helps too, naturally. Nothing says reconciliation with the past like a gift shop near a ruin. Cinema extends this logic by transferring the convict structure of entrapment into the modern landscape. Wake and Fright is the obvious case, and for good reason. Though it is not a convict film in the literal sense, it is profoundly shaped by Convict Gothic. Its schoolteacher protagonist, John Grant, is not chained in a penal settlement, but he is caught in a social and geographical trap that functions much the same way. The outback town of Bundanyaba becomes a secular Port Arthur, isolated, coercive, ritualized, and governed by forms of masculine violence that pass themselves off as hospitality. The horror lies not in supernatural intrusion, but in social absorption. Grant is not attacked by monsters. Worse, he is welcomed. This is where Australian Gothic departs from the more decorative habits of European Gothic. There is no need for ruined castles when the pub will do. Wake in Fright presents the landscape as both empty and overbearing, a space that seems to offer freedom while steadily closing down all alternatives. The outback is not picturesque background. It is a character or perhaps an accomplice. Its heat, distance, dust, and glare produce a psychic pressure that echoes the older penal geography of Van Diemen's Land and Norfolk Island. In Convict Gothic, distance from Britain was already punishment. In modern Australian Gothic cinema, distance remains a form of exposure. The individual is left too far from help, too close to violence, and much too close to himself. This pattern recurs across Australian Gothic film more broadly. The landscape consumes. Roads lead nowhere useful. Communities become claustrophobic. Masculinity curdles into threat. Authority appears either absent, corrupt, or useless, which is at least consistent. The convict system's central contradiction, reform through brutality, mutates into a wider cultural suspicion that Australian spaces produce ordeals rather than transformations. Characters do not enter the interior and emerge purified. They enter and are tested, diminished, or erased. The old penal dream of moral rebirth survives mainly as a joke told by the scenery. The phrase natural life therefore becomes a useful way to understand the persistence of convict Gothic in music and cinema. It names not only a sentence but a national rhythm, punishment stretched across time until it becomes environment. From convict ballads to Frank the Poet, from Port Arthur memorial songs to Wake in Fright, Australian culture repeatedly returns to figures who are trapped inside systems that claim to civilize them. The result is a Gothic tradition in which history is not past, the landscape is not neutral, and authority is not trusted simply because it has filled out the paperwork. Convict Gothic lays the foundation for this cultural imagination by making Australia appear from the beginning as a place where punishment becomes identity. The chains may be gone, but the echo has proved annoyingly durable.